Hello and welcome back to another series. We're going to do a series of 5 videos on the authorship and dating of the Gospels. I see a lot of misinformation on these topics on my channel from Muslims who seem to get the Gospels confused with the Hadith collections, thinking that they were written down a couple of hundred years after Jesus, and a lot of confusion regarding the titles of the Gospels as well. So we'll do one video for each one of the Gospels, but this will be the intro where we will begin by looking at the topic of the early unity of the Gospels. Until recently, most scholars tacitly assumed that the 4 Gospels first circulated anonymously and that the present titles were first attached to them about AD 125. There is little evidence to support this date as the decisive turning point. It is little more than an educated guess. Now, however, this consensus has been vigorously challenged by Martin Hingel. So what are Hingel's objections to this consensus by some scholars? Well, for one thing, the date is far too late. He begins by saying, let me quote Rudolf Pesch at the beginning of his large 2-volume commentary on Mark as a representative of numerous more recent commentaries. All the inscriptiones and subscriptiones in the Gospel manuscripts are late. The author thinks that this one sentence settles the matter, giving no further reasons for his view. That sounds like a lot of modern critics, doesn't it? Including some on my channel. They just state something and don't substantiate it. Now, Hingel takes issue with the concept that the Gospels would have been circulated for any period of time without a title attached to them. Compared with the usual title of a book in antiquity, Evangelion Kata Matthaion sounds quite unusual. And this is Gospel according to, and then this is Matthaion, Matthew. As a rule, the author would come first in the genitive, followed by the title indicating the content. Now, let's do a quick comparison to see what he's talking about. Here we have Evangelion, Gospel, Kata, according to, and then Matthaion, Matthew. Now, what he's talking about is this, it looks like an OU ending. This is a genitive singular ending, and he's saying, this is what you would expect. You have the author's name in the genitive, and then followed by the title of the work, but this just looks different. Hingel continues, we cannot therefore see the preposition kata, according to, with the accusative as a simple periphrasis for the genitiva sauctoris, which is Bauer's view. The concern was, in fact, to avoid the genitive. Instead, the striking form of the title was used to express the fact that here the gospel was narrated in the particular version of the evangelist in question. Now, this is Martin Hingel, and he continues to get more and more technical, but don't worry, we're going to condense all of this and show you exactly what he's saying and why it's so important, but we don't want to just skip to the end. We want to show why we are going to assert what we are. Now, Hingel goes on to say, what is questionable, however, is their argument that the shorter form is original, and their association of the introduction of the title with a fixing of the canon of the 4 Gospels in the first half of the 2nd century. So Hingel clearly states what he wants to challenge. The shorter form, that would be Kata, Matthaion, according to Matthew, according to Mark, etc. That's the general consensus for what the titles of the Gospels were. Hingel says, I don't think that's right. And then the other thing he wants to challenge is the first half of the 2nd century. That's actually too late. So let's look at an illustration. We have Kata Matthaion, and I have a question mark because that's what Hingel wants to challenge. And then we have Evangelion Kata Matthaion. So this is the shorter form, and this is the longer form, the Gospel according to Matthew. And this is just an example. This goes for all 4 Gospels. Now, why is this significant? Well, the title Evangelion referred rather to the whole canon of the 4 Gospels. So let's cut to a diagram now, and we're going to see represented in this diagram what Hingel is arguing for, and that is very early unity of the Gospels. This is singular, notice, Evangelion, that's translated Gospel, and then this would be according to each one, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So you can see these lines. This is what Hingel is indicating. The shorter form is not original. The form would have been the Gospel, and then, as Hingel says, the title, the Gospel, referred rather to the whole canon of the 4 Gospels. Zahn observes, the title can have arisen only in the light of the fact that the 4 books belong together, i.e. at or soon after their being brought together. Harnack also defines the significance of the title clearly with explicit reference to Zon, Euangelion Kata Markon, and in this case, of course, this would be Mark, is not to be translated the gospel writing according to the tradition which derives from Mark, but the, namely, the one gospel according to Mark's account. So remember the diagram from a very early time. The Gospels were part of a single gospel canon, and they all shared in their title as gospel and according to each of the four traditions. Hengel is talking about ancient manuscripts which preserve the title, and among them would be P4, 64, and 67, which belong together with fragments from Matthew and Luke. This has the inscription Euangelion Kata Matthaion. Presumably, this is the title page of a codex. Roberts dates this papyrus as early as the 2nd century. The long form is also supported by the Old Latin translation, which presumably came into being in the last quarter of the 2nd century, and by the Coptic versions. The procession of witnesses is brought up in the rear with the agreement in terminology between Irenaeus in Lyon and, a little later, Clement of Alexandria, the Muratorian canon in Rome, and Tertullian in Carthage. What is striking here is the complete unanimity over the four titles of the Gospels, and a distribution extending throughout the whole of the Roman Empire towards the end of the 2nd century, from Lyon to Carthage, and as far as the Egyptian Korah. So what is Martin's conclusion after all of this technical jargon? This unanimity of testimony to the titles of the Gospels, for which there are still no variants of any kind in this early period, rules out a late origin from the middle of the 2nd century. Hengel lays out his case next for the importance of titles in antiquity, but first we can stop by Tertullian, who attests to the same thing. He says, "And here I might now make a stand and contend that a work ought not to be recognized, which holds not its head erect, which exhibits no consistency, which gives no promise of credibility from the fullness of its title and the just profession of its author." Back to Hengel, it is extremely improbable that the Gospels were circulated in the communities and used in worship as writings without titles. Particularly, if a new work was read in worship, there had to be an announcement of the kind of writing it was. At the latest, when communities had two different copies of the Gospels, titles had to be used to distinguish them in order to avoid confusion. Where the author was well known to the community, a verbal reference would have been enough. But as soon as his work was copied, sent to other communities, and put in an archive there, a title was absolutely necessary to distinguish it from other works. If, as it is usually argued today, the earliest Gospels were anonymous or lacked titles, because of the pressing need to distinguish them in community libraries, a variation of titles would have inevitably arisen. Whereas in the case of the canonical Gospels, in contrast to that of the countless apocryphal writings, we can detect nothing of this. Now, Hengel does assert Markan priority, Mark being the first gospel. He says this is where the title gospel comes from. Remember, that's how Mark's gospel starts off, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, this helps Hengel narrow down his date range. It must be asserted that in the present state of our knowledge, the titles of the Gospels are by no means late products from the 2nd century, but must be very old. With a considerable degree of probability, they can be traced back to the time of the origin of the four Gospels between 69 and 100, and are connected with their circulation in the communities. Their ultimate root lies in the terminology of Mark, who was the first to call a writing euangelion. Douglas Moo and D.A. Carson conclude, "We have no evidence that these Gospels ever circulated without an appropriate designation, according to Matthew or the like." Now let's move ahead on our timeline a little bit out of the 1st century to Irenaeus in the 2nd century. He gives a very memorable analogy. It is not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer in number than they are. For since there are 4 zones of the world in which we live and 4 principal winds, while the church is scattered throughout all the world, and the pillar and ground of the church is the gospel and the spirit of life, it is fitting that she should have 4 pillars, breathing out immortality on every side and vivifying men afresh. Irenaeus also says, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. Our early attestation of the unity of the four Gospels continues with Tertullian. We lay it down as our first position that the Evangelical Testament has apostles for its authors, to whom was assigned by the Lord himself this office of publishing the Gospel. Of the apostles, therefore, John and Matthew first instill faith into us, whilst of apostolic men, Luke and Mark renew it afterwards. And one more before we conclude from Origen, as quoted by Eusebius. In his first book on Matthew's Gospel, Maintaining the Canon of the Church, he, that is Origen, testifies that he knows only four Gospels, writing as follows: Among the four Gospels, which are the only indisputable ones in the Church of God under heaven, I, Origen, have learned by tradition that the first was written by Matthew, who was once a publican, but afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, and it was prepared for the converts from Judaism, and published in the Hebrew language. The second is by Mark, who composed it according to the instructions of Peter, and the third by Luke, the gospel commended by Paul, and composed for Gentile converts. Last of all, that by John. So let's wrap up this somewhat technical exposition with a couple of conclusions. We've seen very early, i.e. before 100 AD, attestation to the unity, the miniature canon, of the four Gospels. We've seen that it's implausible that the Gospel accounts would have circulated without a title. We've seen that we have no evidence that the Gospels ever circulated without an appropriate designation. And we've seen attestations by the Church Fathers to the fourfold Gospel. We'll wrap up with a rather suggestive statement by F.F. Bruce. It is noteworthy that while the four canonical Gospels could afford to be published anonymously, the apocryphal Gospels, which began to appear from the mid-2nd century onwards, claimed falsely to be written by apostles or other persons associated with the Lord. I hope you enjoyed this introduction and exposition on the early unity of the Gospels. Keep all this in mind. It'll be important as we continue through this series, and I'll see you next time as we go through the authorship and dating of the Gospel of Matthew, and we'll proceed on from there. Thanks for watching.